Hello and welcome to our Armenian news network Groong Week in Review. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and today we'll continue exploring newsworthy topics from the past week, which mainly revolve around the ongoing war in Artsakh. Along with Asbed Bedrossian, we'll be talking with our regular panelists, Asbed Kotchikian and Emil Sanamyan. Emil Sanamyan is a senior research fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in politics in the Caucasus with a special focus on Azerbaijan. Asbed Kotchikian is a senior lecturer of political science and international relations at Bentley University in Massachusetts. Before we begin, however, we'd appreciate your help in reaching a wider audience, so please don't forget to subscribe and like us on whatever platform you listen to us on, and help spread the word by sharing this podcast on your social media channels. Thanks in advance. Hello everyone. So to start off today, I'd like to go back to September 27, essentially from the Turkish-Azeri threats of war for the 2 months since July, and then why it took a long time for anyone in the international community to react and even to recognize that there is a real war in progress, and finally how the world reacted and what it means, and where we're headed from here. Emil, maybe you could start.
Okay, we have heard the threats since July. Of course, there's a whole background story to this. It's not like it just started in July, but in July we had a qualitative change in the nature of threats that we heard from the Turkish leadership. We remember that after the initial fighting in the mountains, Berat area, the Azerbaijani government dispatched its military personnel, including Deputy Defense Minister and the Chief of the Air Force, and also the Chief of the Nakhchivan Army, to Turkey. And during that meeting, the Turkish defense minister said, I think the exact wording was kind of confusing. Basically, he said, we will punish Armenia. I'm not sure to what extent Armenian government took it seriously. At least I don't remember any kind of reaction to that statement or commentary. And then there was a series of other statements later. There were the exercises that we talked about. We saw the deployment of the Turkish Air Force in Azerbaijan, and we saw that in middle September, it was still there because they were doing, flights over Ganja. So this has been kind of in preparation, and I distinctly actually remember talking about preparations. Of course, to estimate and expect exactly the extent and the nature of Turkish participation would have been difficult, but the capability was there, and we saw that starting from September 27. In the major assault, full-blown war against Artsakh and Armenia.
If I may add on this, I think there was also a couple of things in terms of the progress of events. Obviously, July war, but then there were two major sort of military exercises planned in the region. One that included Russia, China, among others, also Armenia, Belarus, Iran. Pakistan did not participate because just a couple of weeks before that they had a major escalation with India. But that was one. And then, of course, the Turkish-Azerbaijani joint military exercises. So this is all happening. The Turkish-Azerbaijani military exercises happened in August. And before that, I think there was one indicator that on the 100th anniversary of the declaration of the Sevres Treaty, when the Armenian government ended up making a strong statement, both at a presidential and prime minister level, it was interesting to see the Turkish reaction that came in. And it came in, among other things, very vocally from the Turkish Defense Ministry, because the Turkish Defense Minister or ministry doesn't necessarily make foreign policy statements. But that, in retrospect, granted, I have to admit, in retrospect, that was a prediction of things to come. So, these things, military exercises and so on, take months to prepare. And I'm not sure, the question that I would have in my mind, and this is something for historians down the line to figure out, whether or not the military exercises would have been a pretext to leave Turkish military equipments in Azerbaijan under the cover of the exercises to start an attack or to wage the attack.
One thing that I would also point out, if anybody has also noticed this, typically when you have a large-scale exercise such as Russia had, Caucasus 2020, basically involving the breadth of forces in a southern military district, which includes Armenia. Normally, this exercises, obviously they're scheduled from day to day. The vulnerability of the forces, or at least the point of vulnerability, is usually the day after the exercise. And if we look back at Georgia War of 2008 and Saakashvili's attack and effort to take South Ossetia in August of 2008, that attack began, people remember that it happened during the Olympic Games, but it also began a day after the Russian exercises Caucasus 2008 concluded, which usually, when troops go back to the barracks and, the equipment starts to get repaired, etc. So that period right immediately after the large-scale exercise is typically the period of the most sort of unpreparedness by the forces, and it takes time to get things back to gear. So in this case too, the attack starting on September 27 happened the day after the Caucasus 2020 concluded. I don't think it's just a coincidence.
Right. Coincidences don't just happen, there's a logic to it. But Hovik, when you mentioned earlier about the diplomatic reaction and so on, I think the international community's reaction, I think the fact that a couple of things. First of all, the timing, I think overall with the pandemic, general pandemic, and the second wave or the third wave that some countries have been facing probably has provided some cover or some impetus for Turkey and Azerbaijan to start the attack. The other thing is the US, for instance, has always been involved. Their elections coming up just about 2 weeks now. And overall, the US disengagement from the international arena, the American isolationism in general, these were all factors to also embolden Turkish adventurism in the region. I would like to also add one thing in terms of Russia. There are a lot of analysts out there who argue that Russia was caught off guard. I think if the United States was aware of something brewing a couple of days before the event, before the attack itself, I don't have any doubt in my mind that the Russians were aware. The question is, which we can discuss a bit more now, is why didn't they take any action? I mean, the first reaction from Russia came in only 3 or 4 days after the fighting started, when Lavrov made a statement. And for me, it was significant. The one part of that statement was quite significant, where he said Russia is willing and ready to negotiate a ceasefire independently or within the OSCE Minsk process. And the independently part, I think, is very, very important, that made Russia probably explore options to operate beyond the Euro-Atlantic OSCE process.
And also, we shouldn't forget the meeting that took place between Putin and Erdogan before the war started. Some people speculate that there was some sort of an agreement between the two on the level of Turkish involvement.
Hovik, I think it was a conversation. Erdogan called Putin around the time the exercises started in July, and there was that conversation.
I remember clearly that we expressed some concerns about all the equipment that Turkey was leaving behind in Azerbaijan. This group, actually, we talked about it on one of our podcasts back in September. I don't remember exactly the date, but we can find it if we want.
Yeah, it was around mid-September, because that's when it was clear they was still there. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Russia, I mean, there's no doubt that Russia was following this from the beginning. As the cargo flights started from Turkey into Azerbaijan back in July, cargo flights also began from Russia into Armenia. It's just a question of whether, the extent of Turkish involvement and direct involvement was considered and properly assessed.
Yeah, so we talked about the military aspects. But was there any other diplomatic activity that was taking place that's noteworthy to mention? For instance, what was happening in the OSCE Minsk Group negotiations?
Yeah, there was some movement by OSCE Minsk Group in terms of sort of coming and visiting for the first time after the pandemic and maybe organizing the ministers' meeting, but it never took place. So, yeah, we could say Russia wasn't that active, but I mean, the other two co-chairs were even less active or totally absent, you could say, up until, there was a couple of statements by Macron and Trump and Pompeo, I guess. But still, I mean, Russia is more directly involved in this than anybody else.
Hovik, in the larger context of active foreign policy and active diplomacy, it's quite interesting to also include several points in this discussion. Since mid this year, France has been quite active as a foreign policy. I don't know if this is a strategic decision by France to be diplomatically active around the world. If you remember in August when there was an explosion in Beirut, Emmanuel Macron flew there and he basically made major announcements about being involved. At the same time, Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek-Turkish sort of escalation, it also France was quite active and vocal about it. It seems that when it comes to OSCE, especially in the context of the Karabakh conflict, the OSCE diplomatic activism, it has stopped being a multilateral coordinated action rather than a unilateral actions, sometimes within OSCE, sometimes outside of the OSCE. That includes Russia, as mentioned earlier, trying to work within and outside. and at the same time, France itself taking initiative independent of the OSCE.
Asbed, I was actually going to ask you, do you think France's activities are representing purely France, the EU, the OSCE, or NATO? Is it just France?
It's, I think, to boost France's standing in a larger international relations context. There have always been stages of French activism, foreign policy activism, especially within the context of Brexit. There is a hole in the EU that Germany and France have been trying to occupy, and it seems that Macron has been more aggressive in that sense. So I think it is about being a regional or a global power present in all aspects. So you have that aspect, first of all, as undermining the OSCE itself. You're right, Hovik, that Azerbaijan has expressed its frustration, but never said that they're going to withdraw from the OSCE. So they have expressed their frustration from the OSCE Minsk process repeatedly in the last couple of years. So this is probably one of the reasons why you would see such a disarray in terms of, or lack of coordination when it comes to international action, diplomatic action. And I have been thinking about this as well. The story of the boy who cried wolf, right? With so many escalations or with so many fighting going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan, some might have figured out that, hey, this is another 3-day event that will just settle down soon. And then we can talk about going back to business as usual and so on and so forth. I think in this context, Turkish diplomacy was very well calculated. Turkish diplomacy and action has been well planned in advance, and hence complete escalation.
So I know predicting the future is a thankless job, but can we say anything about where we're going today?
Well, we can see that the southern area, south of Karabakh, equilibrium has not been reached there yet. The Azeri forces continue to move down the river and also towards the main connection between Armenia and NK through Lachin. They're moving in both of those directions. Until there is stabilization there, I think we're going to continue to hear sort of fighting. It appears this, for now, to be the goal of Azerbaijan to capture as much territory in the south as they can, and they've already captured a considerable amount of territory there. So we'll see what exactly happens there, but that's the picture right now.
Adding to what Emil said, I think also the reason why we ended up having 2 failed humanitarian truces in the last week or so is mostly because of the fact that Azerbaijan feels that they are making major advances, military advances, and they want to keep the momentum, and that's why they might not be respecting or abiding by the humanitarian truce. On the other hand, the lack of strong Russian intervention might also indicate that Russia is waiting that both sides, experience fatigue, military fatigue, before they look at Russia as a savior or accept any proposal by Russia under duress.
Right. Okay. Moving on. On Friday, 13 extra-parliamentary political parties in Armenia called on the government to create a coordinating and executive council, which includes former presidents, foreign ministers, and defense ministers, with the authority to make executive decisions regarding the military political developments and to strategize a common action. Is this similar to what was in place during the 1990s? Because maybe I'm mistaken, but I remember hearing one of the arguments, which was that this proposal is intended to replicate the success of the 1990s.
Yeah, that's not something that existed during the First War. As a matter of fact, there was no consul. I mean, there was a supreme consul in Karabakh that was supposedly in charge of it, but really there was a self-defense committee that was in charge of it. And then the self-defense committee was transformed into a state defense committee, and it was basically single-handedly led by Kotchikian, and Babayan was his military deputy, and Arushanyan was his economics deputy. So that's, there was a very centralized structure. There was no consul structure. And in Armenia, of course, Asbed Bedrossian was the president, and Vazgen Sargsyan was his military deputy, and then at some point Hovik Manucharyan came in and then left again. But what is being offered right now, I think, is basically there's a recognition that the current Armenian leader is not handling the situation very well. At least his political opponents, I'm sure, would recognize that. But what to do about that? He's a democratically elected leader. I mean, as long as his party, which has been, I think, conspicuously kind of silent in the last couple of weeks, his party keeps him in power, he will remain in power. If they vote somebody else into power, that would be somebody else in charge. But beyond that, this, I think, any kind of council ideas, I don't think any make any sense. They would just confuse everybody and confuse the situation.
Yeah, I would echo what Emil said in terms of it is a sort of a tacit way or sort of a not so obvious way of criticizing Pashinyan and the government, how it's handling it. I would go even further that many people actually have been drawing parallels not between the first war, but between 1918 and now that, oh yeah, at the time there was, everything was centralized in the hands of one person and so on and so forth. So now they're talking about doing a council, organizing a council. I think it is also a major sort of undermining of state institutions. Even during the first war in the 1990s, yes, there were no established institutions, state institutions. That's why you might have had some level of coordination. Kotchikian, along with other people, consulted for different groups. So did the Bedrossian. But now it seems that if you have a state and if you have a Ministry of Defense and you have a Minister of Foreign Affairs and so on, you can cooperate with them or you can cooperate through them. And this actually has been criticized by none other than Levon Bedrossian himself, who recently, his reaction to this council, he basically considered it as an exercise in futility.
So to remind listeners, the main proponents of this idea are the ARF, the Republican Party, and the Heinrich Party, which is Arthur Vanessian's party. And what is noteworthy is that AHAK, which is the Hayat Congress, affiliated with Levon Bedrossian, actually met the ARF around this topic. Even though in the end they sort of criticized the idea, especially with Levon Bedrossian coming out with a letter on this, it is still amazing that two such opposing parties decided to meet. Emil and Asbed, I realize your arguments against it, but I'm wondering if scoped narrowly, could this idea provide some ground for establishing a semblance or facade of unity? But then I also think of what if this council is toothless, I don't know if the opposition parties would agree to it. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, Hovik, usually at times of crisis, all governments around the world, you would see that they form governments of national unity, that where all the parliamentary members, all the parliamentary parties, unite without actually having any major disagreements. In this case, they could also do the same thing without actually demanding a separate parallel structure to coordinate this. I think this is sowing the seeds for possible future political accounts to settle, issues to settle, and I'm not sure about the government side. Remember, a couple of days prior, different political parties met with Pashinyan, and afterwards they refused to disclose any information, except for at some point the ARF, which mentioned that they have some disagreements with the government's plan or vision and so on. So if you have that disagreements, you don't go ahead and create a parallel institution or structure, even if it is supposed to help or assist. Rather, you provide all your expertise, provide all your resources to the existing institutions for good or bad. Good decisions, bad decisions, right decisions, wrong decisions. At the end of the day, a government is the sole representative, guarantor of its country's safety, military, and political activities.
All right, moving on to the next topic, I wanted to ask you about diaspora involvement. The Armenian diaspora has been mobilized since the first day of the war, and worldwide Armenian communities have been engaged in fundraising, gathering medical and humanitarian assistance, as well as protesting in major cities around the world. How important has this been in the overall war effort, Asbed Kotchikian?
Yeah, I mean, Emil is as knowledgeable about this as I am. This is a natural, instinctive reaction from the diaspora in general. I remember in 1988, the same thing happened. I was old enough to remember the mobilization of the diaspora, not only in terms of rallying, not in terms of only protests, but also in terms of getting aid. Well, we don't need to talk about the aid at this point. It's been a flood of donations, both financial, but also medical and humanitarian aid. But I think the main issue here, and I think we're going to talk about this down the line in terms of the media, especially the international media's lack of interest, which is an extension of the lack of interest by international community about this conflict. I think it managed to bring some attention on the conflict, be that in terms of over 100,000 people in California, in European capitals, in DC, and so on and so forth. I think to a large extent, it is a good way to A, show support, and B, also to raise the issue in international media, which has been quite, I wouldn't say passive, hasn't been paying attention. I remember the first couple of days of the conflict, it was the front news in most news media, but then within third, fourth day, it just slipped into secondary, tertiary importance, even though the conflict was escalating. So I think this is an attempt to bring back the spotlight on the issue and say, why are American citizens of Armenian descent taking on the streets? Why are French and Belgian and German Armenians taking on the streets, highways, and closing down? I think it is an added value, and let's not underestimate the need for moral support. I think in this case, at times of wars in general, moral support and moral sort of strength is needed as much as the military strength of a country.
If I can add to that, I would say that, of course, compared to 30 years ago, now you have a much larger diaspora of Armenians from Armenia. That means both that people actually personally know a lot of people who are directly in harm's way, and unfortunately are not with us anymore. Also, there's been a lot more sort of reverse traffic. I mean, I've seen people going back to Armenia to support the country in a way they can. This is much more, significant than it ever was before. And in terms of the pandemic, the role the pandemic had, I think because of the pandemic, you've had kind of a quiet in the international war kind of a beat. Not too many active wars have been going on, so that actually helped bring the media spotlight to this conflict in a way that it rarely does get that. So you had even, PBS NewsHour having its own correspondent there for a week, and a couple other sort of premier channels, BBC and Al Jazeera reporting from on the ground, and Russians reporting from on the ground. I have to say, there's been a lot of maligning of Margarita Simonyan of Russia Today, and there's definitely reasons to criticize her. But Russia Today was there before many of the Armenian channels or Armenian media, and to this day they have a correspondent there. Basically boarded the plane on the same day of the fighting started, or the day after, and arrived the day after in Karabakh, and has been there since then. So that's also part of the diaspora response, you could say.
Okay, I also wanted to have a quick discussion around the Russian diaspora, given what we saw happen in July. Emil, are you aware of any major news in terms of protests from Russia? I realize that freedom of assembly is restricted in that country, but maybe I've missed some news items here and there.
Well, we cannot have protests the way we have in the West. There is no freedom to protest in Russia, and especially when it comes down to ethnic motivated protest, that's considered as sort of a security emergency. And from day one, the embassy there and the community leadership basically urged Armenians not to protest. But at the same time, you had obviously a lot of people like Ruben Vartanyan and Samuel Karapetyan contributing a lot of money, and other, making statements and trying to influence the response by their government whatever they can. But it's not the same as here. You can't just come out and block the street. It's not protest at the White House or something. So that's just a different type of.
Yeah, I would add that this kind of the motivation of Hovik's questions, I've heard it, not the motivation, but probably the premise of Hovik's question. I've heard it on social media by others as well, saying what are the Russian Armenians in Russia are doing, and so on and so forth. I think there is an element of PR, especially in Western countries. You take one step and you publicize it, 10 times. Whereas in the case of the Russian Armenians, there has been a significant flow of both financial as well as individuals returning back home. As Emil mentioned. And that was also interesting that I was thinking about this, and in an earlier piece I was writing, I wanted to include Ruben Vartanyan's and Samuel Karapetyan's statements. For me, it was also interesting that how these two Russian Armenian businessmen and so on, when they were appealing or they were raising the issue, it also came in from the angle to incite Russia to intervene or encourage Russia to intervene. I'm not sure about the dynamic, whether or not this is also coordinated or encouraged by the Russian authorities to send a message that Russia will intervene when it feels that it is needed or if there are red lines to be crossed. But I think this has been pan-diaspora mobilization without any exception, I have to mention. And again, the only time I have seen something at this magnitude, which wasn't as publicized, was in 1988, starting in February, but also, unfortunately with the earthquake, it reached its zenith in the earthquake coordination.
Yeah, the magnitude of this event is much more like the earthquake than even the war of early 90s, because of the intensity of it and the impact it's having. And the impact it has had in terms of people turning out to support Armenia. I've personally, know people who haven't been involved in Armenian things for years, but they're coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, or, been encouraged to come out and have come out and contributed, supported, and are supporting in the ways they can.
One other thing I want to add overall, which is not related to any of the things we discussed, but the prevalence of social media and of course the edited even videos and so on. One becomes, at least if you are a bit critical, you would think twice before trusting whatever's coming up. The level of disinformation, but also the level of media material available online. I remember in 1988, I was still in Lebanon. The only way that we could get the news and actually see events or things were basically pirated video clips, video cassettes that used to come out of Armenia, people coming back, and we would just gather in someone's house and watch, and we couldn't make sense anything at the time. You could just have to have someone to interpret, and not that you can make much sense about all the videos out there. So the prevalence of the social media reaching everyone, even if they're sitting in Guam or wherever it is, an Armenian, that is a sense of it's a national cry. This is one of the things. As much as this is represented as a territorial conflict and so on, the element of nationalism and national identity and camaraderie is quite high, not only on the Armenian side, but also the Azerbaijani side. This is the sad reality of wars and conflicts where you just end up, forget about everything else, the ethnos, you need to protect the ethnos and so on and so forth. And I have to say, this is one of the things about the new diaspora, quote unquote, the Armenians who had left Armenia in the last 10, 20 years, regardless of what reservations they had politically about any regime, be that the previous regime or the current regime. For them, this is an existential problem that they have to come back to. Just in parallel, just for an example, I want to add one thing. In 1979, 78, when there was a revolution in Iran, the new regime got rid of all the military. They forced them to retire. Some of them retired themselves. But then within a year, when there was a war with Iraq, most of the people, most of the army officers and so on voluntarily came back, even though they didn't trust the regime. But for them, it was about the protection of the fatherland, the protection of the land. And they fought under the flag of a regime that they didn't agree with, but understanding that this is a larger existential issue.
Asbed, you mentioned social media, and I wanted to ask you a question. I think we covered this in our last episode when we talked about the benefits of social media and how it helps us to mobilize. But I'm interested in the sort of other aspects of social media and the potential negative effects, the psychological effects that it has on people. I'm guilty of this myself, where I find myself spending way too much time on social media, constantly looking for new information. And I think this phenomenon is unique in modern wars, and there have been few examples of such wars to date, where every major conquest or advance is recorded and broadcast on the internet. And I find myself comparing this with World War II, where I'd imagine that they get news once every maybe few weeks, and people didn't spend their entire remainder of their time hunting for new information because it didn't exist. Yes, they were tired, they were hungry, but they went back to their factories to make, I'm not sure, weapons or whatever else that was required for the war effort, and maybe they were more mentally healthy by doing that. At least that's what I imagine of World War II, and wanted to get your thoughts about it.
In those days, I think they were glued to their radio. There was a lot of culture about families sitting around the radio and listening for information coming from the front from their radio stations. And if you recall, I don't want to get too much into our history, but Groong spun out of the First War back in 1990, 1994, where there was not a lot of online information at the time, and there was just a few friends who started sending and digitizing their local newspapers and sharing it with each other.
Right. Well, it's a completely different time. So I'm hoping that, we can find methods of coping, because I don't think that, at least myself, I feel it on me personally, and I think everyone does. How to handle this?
It's one of the things is that, at events like these, when people expect fast information and daily updates, sometimes even hourly updates. And when there is none, for security reasons, for military security reasons, this is where you start seeing also the rise of manufactured news. Someone rehashing an old news item, or sometimes adding a new twist to it, the memes and so on and so forth. It's quite unnerving, and it's quite problematic. But then, it is a new world. It is a brave new world on so many levels that, it leads to mental paralysis in terms of if constantly following these news, you can't focus on anything else.
Yeah, we gotta take care of the health. So That's kind of the upside of this too, is just it takes its toll so intensely, even on people who are not directly involved, but they're just sort of pushing buttons and, commanding at a distance. Hopefully that will, strain them to a point that they will just say, okay, well, let's take a break.
Probably, I know you were trying to end the discussion, Hovik, but I think another issue that is related to the whole war in the last few weeks is the alarming rise of COVID cases, not only in Armenia, but also there were reports now in Azerbaijan as well. People at the times of conflict and war obviously stop wearing the mask, and this is a message that that needs to be reiterated. Not a lot of people are paying attention to that, and it's from my perspective, it's quite alarming, at least in the case of Armenia, where cases have jumped.
Good advice, Asbed. With that, let's conclude our show. Thank you for our guests and our listeners, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
And that concludes our program for this episode of Groong Week in Review. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from this previous week. We look forward to your feedback and suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's GROONG, and on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next week.